And now welcome to this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
And this week on Where Did the Road Go, we have Laird Scranton, who has written a number of books on the Dogon, The Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol, which is his latest, as well as Sacred Symbols of the Dogon and the Science of the Dogon. And he's also written, his latest book is actually on Velikovsky. And Laird, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you. Thanks.
All right. And that's all the books you've done so far, right? These four?
That's right. These four so far. There's also an earlier self-published book called Hidden Meanings that got republished as The Science of the Dogon.
Okay. All right. And when did you, how did you get involved in this subject matter?
Actually, I can thank my wife for that. She gave me a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark one time, and one of the chapters in this book was about the Dogon and about how they had some astronomical knowledge they shouldn't really have without access to major telescopes.
Okay. And you just started doing research on your own?
Yeah, I thought, well, if they know things about astronomy they shouldn't, that's got to be interesting no matter where it leads. And started digging into it and discovered all sorts of, that was just the tip of the iceberg of the interesting things about this tribe.
Okay. And did you plan on writing books about them?
No, actually, I never did. It sort of happened by accident. I was keeping notes for myself about what I was learning and trying to keep the notes organized. And after a while, realized that I haven't had enough material to write an article if I wanted to, and eventually enough material to write a book. And I thought, well, why not? It's so inexpensive to self-publish. Put it in book form.
And you self-published it. How did it end up on Inner Traditions?
Well, then I was trying to promote the book through targeted emails to people who might be interested, and one of those emails reached Egyptologist John Anthony West, who had an interest in the book and ended up taking it down to New York to a publishing fair and personally shopping publishers until he found Inner Traditions.
That's awesome. So you've written 3 books on the Dogon so far, and you want to give people a little history of who the Dogon are and why they're so important?
Sure. The Dogon are interesting. They're a modern-day tribe from Africa, from Mali, which is in northwest Africa, in sort of the bulge there of Africa. And they represent a kind of crossroads of ancient traditions. They have rituals like ancient Judaism and civic traditions like ancient Egypt, and they have a cosmology that looks a lot like ancient Buddhism. And the thing about them is that they're a living tribe with living priests who understand their own references, and they can explain what the symbols and the myths are supposed to mean.
And they were first investigated back when?
There were 2 French anthropologists started in the 1930s and spent 3 decades with the tribe documenting their religion and their language. And they were named Marcel Griol and Germain Dieterlen. And they put together a number of articles and a couple of books about the Dogon, including an anthropological study called The Pale Fox. And this is the major source of information about the tribe.
Okay, and that's where the information about their astronomical knowledge comes from, isn't it?
That's right. That pretty much everything that is known about the Dogon came out of those 3 decades of study.
Okay, and what's so unusual about their astronomical knowledge?
Well, you start with the stars of Sirius, which Sirius is the brightest star in the night sky. It's the star you see if you follow where the belt stars of Orion point downward to, you see this really bright star, and that's Sirius. But in truth, it's not really one star. It's at least 2 stars. There's a sun-like star that's very bright, and there's a small dwarf star that you can't see because of the glare of the brighter star. And the Dogon knew that the second star existed, and they knew the correct orbital period for the 2 stars, and some other information about that star system that scientists, our scientists didn't know until probably in the 1950s or 1960s.
Okay, and now do the Dogon say there's 3 stars?
Yeah, the Dogon say there are 3, and the astronomers have not actually completely verified the 3rd star. There have been sightings of the 3rd star and claims to have seen it, but I don't think there's been final verification that a 3rd star exists there.
Okay, and what is the importance of Sirius to the Dogon tribe?
Well, the Dogon their most important ritual celebration happens every 60 years. Actually, they say it happens every 60 years. It's really every 50 years. And it's to celebrate the stars of Sirius. But when you get into their cosmology, the real importance of Sirius is that they equate it to a structure of matter. They say that what happens up in the microcosm above us relates to what happens in the macrocosm above us. It relates to what happens in the microcosm below us, and that if we want to see examples of this, Sirius plays a role in this macrocosmic example of how matter is formed.
Okay. Don't they also claim their ancestors came from Sirius or were related to Sirius in some way?
It depends on who you talk to. I mean, they associate some ancient teachers with Sirius, and Robert Temple's book, The Sirius Mystery, heavily leaned towards claims that they represented an alien contact with humans back in ancient times. Oh. But the Dogon don't overtly say that their teachers came from Sirius.
Okay, all right. Well, that's an interesting point, because you always hear that they said explicitly that they came from Sirius, so they didn't.
No, although the Dogon do talk about a non-human source of information, as the Buddhists do. They talk about spiritual beings. That, again, there is an association with Sirius, but it's not as overt as saying somebody came from Sirius to the Earth to visit us.
Okay. Well, let me throw this idea at you then. Could it be that I know you're familiar with Walter Cruttenton's work?
Yes, absolutely.
And could it be that if he's right and we move through different phases of consciousness and are in a binary system with Sirius, that when Sirius is closer, we have access maybe to these teachers who are at a higher level of consciousness, or something we can't perceive at a lower level of consciousness?
That could be. I mean, the Dogon priests say that these stars of Sirius, especially this little dwarf star, which is very dense, regulate events that happen in our region of the universe. And so there is a suggestion there that we could be involved in another rotation that hasn't been recognized, that involves our sun and Sirius.
Okay, all right. Now, there's argument over whether or not the Dogon's information it was taken from us, from visitors to their tribe, or if it was actually genuine ancient knowledge. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, the most difficult to argue point that says that it was ancient knowledge is that all of the Dogon system of cosmology, their whole creation tradition, is given using words that are ancient Egyptian words. And so Carl Sagan made the argument that a modern visitor must have come to the Dogon and taught them some scientific knowledge. But the difficulty is it would be hard to imagine which modern visitor would have taught that to them using ancient Egyptian words. Also, the fact that all the same concepts that even exist in the ancient Egyptian language demonstrates that it has to have been ancient knowledge.
Okay. All right. And some of it we didn't really know at the time either, did we?
No, we didn't. At the time Carl Sagan wrote, we didn't know that. I was the first person to really explore whether there could be connections between the words.
Okay.
And it's a very complicated system of cosmology they have, using very well-defined terms. And each of these terms, you can link back to the Egyptian hieroglyphic language. One of the features of the words is that every word has at least two meanings, and the two meanings are distanced from each other in a way so that knowing one doesn't enable you to guess the second meaning.
Well, that's
interesting. So when you find these sets of meanings that are logically disconnected, reproduced in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language under the same pronunciation, you really have a lock on a correlation.
Okay, and there's also connections with ancient Hebrew and Indian, and you're saying Chinese cultures now too, right?
Yes, there's a lot of the Egyptian words. Even Sir Wallace Budge, who wrote the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, he frequently uses Hebrew words and letters to explain the pronunciation and meanings of Egyptian words. A lot of the Dogon words are also Egyptian words and are also Hebrew words, and you can find equivalencies across there. But these concepts, these sets of concepts where you have multiple meanings associated with the concept, cross the boundaries of cultures and of languages. So in Buddhism and in India, where you have concepts expressed in languages that are based on Sanskrit, you can still make a correlation back to the Dogon because the terms are connected to these same sets of meanings.
Okay. Now, can you go a little bit into the Dogon creation story?
Sure. I mean, it really is science. They talk about how their tribal god created matter. And I could see when I was researching them that they had the definition of an atom correct and the definition of protons and neutrons and electrons correct, and that they even drew a picture to diagram it that looked like the image of an electron orbit that you get using an electron microscope. And so I thought, if they have those top structures right, what are the chances that the descending levels of matter that they describe could also be right? And so I started educating myself about that, reading Brian Greene and Stephen Hawking, and discovered that you could lay the Dogon description side by side with descriptions from Hawking or from Brian Greene, and right next to side by side the diagrams that both give, and you could. It's an obvious comparison. It's you don't even have to make an argument. They are intuitively the same.
Okay, and they start also with and they use like deity names and such to relate these things, but they're still in a scientific context. Is that how a good way of explaining it?
That's a good way of explaining it. The Dogon system seems to represent a very early version of the Egyptian, and in the Dogon system, it hasn't evolved to the level of deities yet. It's still being couched in terms of scientific concepts, but by the time you get and also in terms of symbolism, but by the time you get to Egypt, then each of these stages of matter has become personified with a deity in Egypt whose traditional role tells you what stage of matter they're talking about.
Okay, what are the stages of matter? And
in one of my books, I have, I think, a 5-page layout of the structure of matter from waves to atom that are expressed strictly in terms of Egyptian glyphs and deities and words. And so there are many, many multiple stages here, but basically it goes from waves to an act of perception interferes with matter in its wave-like form and causes it to be reorganized to form what science calls a Calabi-Yau space, and the Dogon call it the egg of the world. And this vibrations cause what appear to us to look like particles of matter, and these particles of matter eventually create mass, and mass eventually creates gravity, and you eventually end up with small particles of matter that combine together to form atoms and so forth.
And so basically what we're talking is they're describing quantum physics.
They're describing a system that really is torsion theory. Torsion theory is a version of string theory that it differs from string theory in that it postulates that at every point in space-time there's this tiny little vortex that is responsible for the force of gravity.
Wow. Okay, that's a fairly new theory.
Yeah, these are fairly new theories. String theory didn't even reach the public consciousness till about 1980, and the French anthropologists had documented this with the Dogon by 1956. So there's no chance that there was borrowing from string theory.
Right. What now? Has anyone looked at the Egyptian mythology in this way prior to you doing this?
I mean, I have. I've taken each aspect of this Dogon creation tradition, the words, the symbols, the myths, and so forth, and tracked each one to an Egyptian counterpart. That's what really I do in the first 2 books I wrote, Science of the Dogon and the Sacred Symbols of the Dogon.
Right, but before that, has anyone ever looked at the Egyptian myths as if they were a scientific creation story?
There were suggestions of it, but nobody was really able to demonstrate that it was true. But when you go back into India, there are a lot of resemblances between science and myth. And there have been numerous people over the years who have said, hey, this looks like science to me.
Okay.
So I'm not the first person to do that, but I think I am the first one to be able to show in a coherent way that the Egyptian system looks like science.
Okay, all right. So what this basically says is that all these cultures have a connection further back in history that they've split off from.
That's right. If you go back far enough in any one of the traditions, what you bump into is the idea that somebody smarter than we were made a deliberate attempt to raise our educational status up, our civilized status up from being hunter-gatherers to being farmers. And that they deliberately presented what looks like a civilizing plan that is associated with all these symbols and all these myths that were supposed to help us acquire the skills we needed to be able to do that.
So it's kind of like a hidden scientific map as well underneath it all.
Yes, I mean, I compare it to if you have a 2-year-old who wants to know where babies come from, most parents realize that they need to tell the child a story that is based on something real, even if it doesn't include all of the intimate details. They tell them that a part of the mother comes together, father comes together with a part of the mother and creates a baby. Well, that's sort of the way that these myths and these traditions were created, was on different levels, where in the outer level you get the 2-year-old's version of the story, and the deeper into it you get, the closer you get to the actual science.
Okay. Now, how did they preserve this tradition?
Originally, it was all mnemonic. It was all by oral tradition. There was no system of writing, and the Dogon tradition does not have a native system of writing, but it has a lot of the same symbols connected to a lot of the same meanings as were used in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language. And so it's traditionally thought that cosmology preceded writing in these ancient cultures. It looks to me as if these symbols that were already well defined in the cosmology ended up being adopted as written characters in the earliest languages.
Okay. And they have a process of building that also is mnemonic for them, correct?
Well, they have a number of techniques and approaches they use towards symbolism. At the most basic, it starts with what the Buddhists call adequate symbols. An adequate symbol is something. It's defined as a symbol that cannot lose its meaning, even if the initiates to the tradition forget what it means. And the way that works is because the image is something that you can actually see in nature that's connected to a specific thing, like the shape of an electron orbit. It's perfectly natural, if you can see the shape of an electron orbit, to associate that with the concept of an electron. Mm-hmm. And so even if, for thousands of years we all forgot what that shape meant, eventually we'd be able to recover that once we had the technology to see it again.
I see. Okay. And what do you think this culture is that tried to preserve all this information? Do you have any thoughts on that?
About who the teachers were?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's hard to say. I can say for certain that it looks like they had our best interests at heart, because they didn't seem to pull any punches at all. They gave us the truthful explanations of what all these processes of creation are, and they seem to have bent over backwards to give it to us in the best way that they could. The Dogon asked their teachers if they were God, and the teachers answered, "No, we're not God, but you can think of us, if you want to, as agents of God."
So do you think there's a connection there to like the Anunnaki or other types of civilizers elsewhere in the world?
Yes, absolutely. This tradition dates from around 3000 BC, and in any of these ancient cultures, one of my books, the third book, Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol, one of the purposes of the book is to try to lay out what I consider to be the signature signs of this tradition. And by that, I mean that if you see one of these in an ancient culture, it's a pretty good indicator that they had the same educational system.
Okay, can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, the easiest example, the most familiar example would be the 4 elements: water, wind, earth, and fire. You see that in the culture, and it's pretty certain that they had the same tradition.
And you don't think that could be a coincidence?
No, not really. The reason it can't. Another example I tend to use is the concept of pyramid building. Mm-hmm. Critics will say, well, look, any two cultures that use stone as their primary building material are going to eventually think to stack these stones up and make a pyramid out of them. So you can't say that those are connected at all. That's a natural thing that somebody would do. And my answer to that is to say that's true, but there's a very complicated symbolism that attaches to these forms. It's the same in South America as it is in Africa, as it is in Asia.
not only that, but they all tend to have astronomical alignments. And why would all these cultures decide to do that?
That's right, and it's not just the astronomical alignments, but they use the astronomical alignments to do things like control their agricultural cycle. And these are commonalities that go way beyond the possibility of coincidence. So it's the symbolism that demonstrates that it can't just be coincidence or can't be parallel development.
All right. So now the Dogons have a different view of like deities and gods and stuff, don't they?
Yeah. Well, for the Dogon, the only thing they really define as a deity or as a god is the piece of the creation process that's at the very beginning that they can't explain. Like, that when a sperm comes together with an egg, that causes a process of life to start. Well, nobody tries to explain what makes that happen. And when you reach that point of the thing that you don't try to explain, that's the point where they assign the deity.
Okay. Now, Amma is their
creator god.
Their creator god. Okay.
And he's a counterpart to Amen in Egypt.
Okay. Now, but they don't worship him necessarily, do they?
No, they don't. As a matter of fact, they use the word celebrate, where later traditions use the word worship. It's very interesting to see the way things change. Where the later religions have an opposition between good and evil, the Dogon have an opposition between truth and error. And so the Dogon version of this stuff is a very non-judgmental, very clear-headed incarnation of what became the later religions.
Interesting. Now, they also said that Amma is it infinitely small or just very, very small?
Yes, that's a secret. That's something that's not typically talked about in open among the Dogon. Only the initiates talk about that or know that. But in fact, that Amma is very, very, very small. It's because Amma resides at the point where perception causes a wave to turn into a particle.
Okay. All right. So it's almost like the point where consciousness interacts with matter.
That's right. Absolutely. And same thing. There's one set of symbols here, one thread of symbols that simultaneously represent the creation of matter and the processes of biological reproduction and the processes of the creation of the universe. These are the three creational themes that some very intelligent person put a system together that are all defined in parallel terms.
Okay. Now, is he considered a dual god, or is he a singular point that becomes duality?
He's dual, and with a lot of the cosmological terms, you can see it in the term itself. Amma is really a compound of two words. Means knowledge, and the comparison I make is to the word to know in the biblical sense refers to conception of biological conception. In the Bible, it says, he knew her, and they're talking about he conceived a baby. Ma is an Egyptian term that refers to perception, which is the initiating stage of matter. So Amma combines the initiating stage of biological reproduction with the initiating stage of matter into one term.
Okay. All right. Let's also there are the pneumo fish in their culture. And there's this symbolism also you get in Sumeria and other cultures. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the pneumo fish is one of the drawings that the Dogon priests make to explain how things work. And the Dogon priests say that these drawings are so essential to the concepts that they're describing that they feel that they can't even discuss the concepts without drawing them in the sand with a stick at the same time. They need the drawing in order to explain the thing. So the pneumo fish drawing is a diagram that from my point of view, demonstrates what happens when a wave is perceived. Now, in string theory, if you read Brian Greene or Stephen Hawking or any of the people who are writing about string theory, nobody ever talks about how is it that an act of perception causes matter to change from wave-like behavior to particle behavior. But the Dogon do. The Dogon talk about in great detail about that process.
And how?
Go ahead.
Oh, how do they say that works?
Okay, if you know about quantum theory and about Heisenberg says that when you get down to small enough particles, we don't have tools small enough to be able to observe them without disturbing them. So inherently, if you look at something that's very, very, very small, the very act of observing it changes it. Well, when you get down to massless waves, which are at the bottom of the whole structure, any act of perception has got to disturb it. And if it's a massless wave to begin with, which is the same thing as having no acceleration, the only way you can disturb it is by accelerating it and giving it mass. And so they say that an act of perception causes this underlying wave to draw up like a tent. Imagine a piece of tent cloth that you grab in the middle and you pull up in the middle to create a tent-like shape. And that drawing up of the tent causes the waves above it to encircle and starts a process of repetitive encircling that happens 7 times to create these Calabi-Yau spaces. The Calabi-Yau space in string theory is considered to be a little point in space and time that represents 7 wrapped up dimensions.
Right. Okay. And
the way that Dogon describe it, these dimensions don't have enough mass to support their own weight, and so they collapse.
Okay. Now, I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this question. You're the first person who has interpreted this stuff this way, correct?
Right, and one of the things I had to worry about, one of the biggest things I had to worry about coming into this was how do you defend against your own wishful interpretation of something? Mm-hmm. And so one of the rules I made for myself was that every interpretation has to start with either an explicit statement on the part of the culture I'm studying, or it's got to be something that's understood the same way by more than one culture. Well, now as I move along and I've studied India and Tibet and Egypt and Africa and now into China, I have enough different cross-referencing sources that I can compare one to the other about what they say about a given subject matter. And when I can show that they're all in agreement, then I know that I'm on fairly firm ground in terms of the interpretation that I'm moving forward with.
Okay. And they also believe in sort of a creation via word, right?
The word is one of the metaphors they use to explain what happens. We talked about water, wind, earth, and fire. Mm-hmm. That's an example of a 4-stage metaphor that is used to help us understand a complex set of symbols. They provide a number of these 4-stage metaphors, and so, for example, one of them is given in terms of the animal kingdom. They talk about at the lowest level are insects, and then fish, and then 4-legged animals, and then birds. Well, if you look at those metaphors, they help you to understand things like Egyptian gods who have animal heads. If you see that Kheper, the dung beetle Kheper, who has the head of an insect, you know automatically by the fact that it is an insect that his symbolism is going to fall in the earliest stage of matter. He represents the concept of non-existence coming into existence. Or if you look at Thoth, who has the head of a bird, you know automatically by this metaphor that his symbolism is going to fall at the high end of matter.
Okay, well, do you think that the Egyptian mythology was just more, like it evolved more away from the origin than the Dogons did?
Yes, whoever put the system together realized that things evolve over time. You know, they know they knew about the game Telephone, if you've ever played it. And so what they did was that one of the traditions that happened in ancient times was periodically they would send a priestly group out into the wilderness with the task of deliberately locating themselves someplace very inhospitable and very inaccessible, sort of as a way of making a backup of the tradition. And that's what I think the Dogon are. The Dogon are located an 8-hour drive from anything you'd ever want to visit. They're in the middle of the desert along a lengthy series of cliffs, and they've lived fairly much in isolation where they can maintain their own tradition without interference from other people.
Wow.
And there are priestly tribes like this around the world, and other groups that observe the same tradition, like the Hopi Indians, had the tradition of sending out priestly groups to relocate themselves the same way.
Do you see any connections between cultures in North or South America and the Dogon yet?
Yep, absolutely. As a matter of fact, the book I just am finishing up on China makes a direct connection between China, Mongolia and China, and North America.
Oh, wow. Okay. And what's that one going to be called?
That's a good question. My working title is China and the Plan of Ancient Cosmology. But when you work with a publisher, one of the few tools the publisher has to sort of posture a book in the marketplace is its title.
Right.
And so they tend to be very, very picky about what they want to name a book. And very rarely do they go with the working title that the author came up with.
All right. Well, the last thing on the Dogon I guess I want to ask you about is the controversy involving Walter Van Beek.
Okay. Walter Van Beek. Okay. We talked about the French anthropologist who studied the Dogon for 30 years until Marcel Griaule died suddenly in 1956. In 1975, Robert Temple wrote his book, The Serious Mystery, and suddenly the Dogon became very, very controversial because Temple was trying to use them as evidence of an alien contact.
Mm-hmm.
Now, suddenly it became important to send another team into the Dogon country to restudy them. It's not uncommon in the world of anthropology for an anthropologist to restudy some part of the work of a previous anthropologist. But in this case, they sent Walter Van Beek, who was a Belgian, in, and Walter Van Beek's specialty was ecology. They sent him in to do a restudy, not just of a piece of Griaule's work, but really to restudy the entire life's work of Griaule, which was about religion, not ecology. And Griaule had described a tradition with the Dogon that we call the esoteric tradition. It's a complicated secret tradition. And the way it works is that any Dogon tribesperson has the right to learn the innermost secrets of the tradition if they just continue to ask the next leading question that leads them the next step towards understanding it. It's the job of the initiate to ask the question to learn more. And so if I, as an initiate, ask an appropriate question, a Dogon priest is obligated to give me a truthful answer. But if I were to come in from the outside and ask a question that was inappropriate to my initiated status, they're required to remain silent or to tell a lie if they have to protect the secrets. And so Van Beek and his team came in from outside, even though they knew that Griaule had documented that the tradition works this way. Van Beek's team came in, starting asking leading questions about Griaule's work, and everybody in the Dogon tribe said, I don't know about that. Don't ask me. I never heard of that. I compare what he did to a visitor who goes to a college campus on Parents' Weekend and comes away having found no evidence of drug or alcohol use. So Van Beek came away saying, we can't recreate Griaule's findings, and so clearly his study is flawed, that we think the Dogon priests invented this system just to satisfy Griaule. It doesn't really exist. It's not real. But I was fortunate in that, he made that determination around 1985. Now, around 2005, my daughter Hannah went to India and came back telling me about a ritual shrine called a stupa that she'd seen all around India that she thought resembled a shrine that the Dogon make. And so she and I sat down and I made some predictions about the symbolism of the stupa, sight unseen, and we used the internet to demonstrate that each of those predictions was right. And then I did some study about the symbolism of a stupa and discovered that it relates to a cosmology that's point for point the same as what Griaule documented in terms of this Dogon shrine. The two systems match. So I then wrote an article for Anthropology News through the University of Chicago that basically said, look, Van Beek can't possibly be right about this, because if Griaule's system matches the Buddhist system, then both have to be legitimate.
Right. Huh. All right. Well, we're going to take a quick 45-second break, and we're going to come back and talk to you about Velikovsky.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Do you want to tell people where they can get your books?
Books, well, they're available at all the usual outlets. If you want, you can start with my publisher's website, www.innertraditions.com, or you can find them pretty much on any book. If you can Google my name on Google or any one of the search engines and find references to the books. There are probably 30,000 outlets out there where you can get the books. You can go to Amazon, you can go to buy.com, you can go to barnesandnoble.com. And
you do and don't have a website?
There is a website under my name, but it's not really my official website. The guy who put it together seems to have done a good job, and there is valid information about me there and the ability to contact me from it.
And that's LairdScranton.com.
That's right.
Okay, we'll be back in 45 seconds with Laird Scranton.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live guests via email or the live chat room. You can also check out our upcoming schedule, blog, links section, book reviews, videos, and links to our Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, and much more. That's wheredidtheroadgo.com.
And tonight we have Laird Scranton, author of many books on the Dogon, and his latest is the Velikovsky Heresies. So, Laird, how did you get interested in Velikovsky?
Well, Emanuel Velikovsky was a very interesting character, and I first learned about him when I was in high school in Portland, Oregon. Portland was sort of a hotbed of support for this crackpot's crackpot. Velikovsky was a psychiatrist and a historian who was a longtime colleague of Albert Einstein's. And he was researching a book in New York at Columbia University in the 1940s and came across some ancient Egyptian texts that seemed to be describing the 10 plagues of Egypt as if they were a real historical event. And so Velikovsky became interested in that and began following leads from Egypt and from other cultures relating to this kind of a global cataclysm, and discovered that all the cultures were saying the same thing. They were saying that the destruction was caused by a comet, and the name that they gave to the comet initially, they eventually assigned to the planet Venus in culture after culture. They did it in the Middle East, and they did it in South America, and they did it in Asia. They did it all over the world. And so Velikovsky evolved the theory that Venus had to be a recent addition to our solar system, not billions of years old. And this was a very, very controversial theory back in 1950. He wrote a book called Worlds in Collision that turned the scientific community on its head and sold thousands and thousands of books based on the idea that Venus was a new planet.
Okay.
Okay, so Velikovsky died in 1979, mostly persona non grata. He, even though there are many aspects of his theory that over time were shown to be reasonable, the mainstream scientists never bought into his theory and did everything they could to try to discredit him. And by the time he died, he really was considered to be an outsider in science. Even to this day, if there are new discoveries that are made in astronomy that look like they might support Velikovsky, his name's not mentioned. The new announcement is usually accompanied by a second theory that is whose purpose or whose net effect is to distance that finding from Velikovsky.
Now, why do you think that is?
I think it is because Velikovsky's theory was very threatening to the scientists of 1950. He was talking about religious events from the Bible that the scientists treat as if they were mythical or as if they were fairy tales. Velikovsky was trying to show that they were historical. So from the standpoint of the dichotomy between religion and science, that was a little bit threatening. But more important than that, Velikovsky was claiming that his claim that a planet could be only a few thousand years old, not a billion years old, was a threat to the the concept of uniformitarianism in the universe. This is a concept that is essential to Darwinism. Darwinism, for evolution, the concept of evolution to be correct, it requires long, long periods of time where things work exactly the same as they always have.
Now, but it doesn't really directly threaten evolution in a biological sense.
No, it doesn't. But it turns a number of important astronomic theories on their head. I mean, it created problems for theories of planet formation, for example. If the planets formed the way the astronomers say they formed, then Venus can't possibly be thousands of years old.
Okay. Right,
so there are turf issues and there are theory issues that made Velikovsky a threat. And then to make matters worse, Velikovsky was a person who had a reputation of his own, an international reputation. He had been involved in the founding of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem alongside Einstein, and he had edited an academic journal in Berlin alongside Einstein, and he was a colleague of Einstein's at Princeton. And so Velikovsky had a reputation that they couldn't just ignore.
Right, and they did try to boycott his book to get the publisher to get rid of it, didn't they?
Yeah, there was a very unusual situation that arose where the lead astronomer at Harvard University organized a boycott of the textbook division of Velikovsky's publisher as a way to arm twist them into not publishing the book. And this is not the way that academic scientists are supposed to behave.
And did it work?
It did in a way. The original publisher, Macmillan and Company, had a runaway bestseller book, and they ended up transferring the rights to a company called Doubleday that had no textbook division as a way of defusing this boycott.
Wow. Now I heard something about like the person who made that decision ended up getting fired or something.
Yes, the guy who initially signed Velikovsky got fired, and any astronomer with a reputation who tried to support Velikovsky had difficulties work-wise. I think the guy who ran the planetarium in Boston was fired because he dared to plan a show that supported Velikovsky's view of events.
Okay. And Velikovsky's view of events, can you give us an outline of what Velikovsky suggested happened?
Yes, and it's based primarily on ancient texts and ancient myths, which again is a problem for astronomers. Astronomers are not used to having that kind of evidence put forth to present an astronomic theory. But Velikovsky says that back sometime before 1500 BC, some kind of an astronomic body slammed into Jupiter, and as a consequence of that, Venus was ejected from Jupiter. And that it was ejected as a comet that was so bright that the ancient cultures at first didn't even recognize Venus as being a planet. They grouped it alongside the sun and the moon because it was so bright. You could see it move across the sky during the daytime.
Wow.
So Venus, which was in the same plane as the planet's orbits, moved through the solar system and wreaked havoc on the planets, according to Velikovsky. It made a head-on impact with Mars, and following that, both Venus and Mars made close contacts with the Earth that created a number of the situations that get described in biblical references, like the 10 plagues of Egypt. Velikovsky blames the titanic eruption of Thera, the volcano, that ended the Minoan Empire and ended the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. He blames all that on the close approach of Venus to the Earth.
Okay.
Velikovsky also says that Mars made a close approach to Earth, responsible for extending the 360-day year that existed in ancient times, according to Velikovsky, and changed it into a 365-day year.
And I had honestly not read Velikovsky till fairly recently, and there's a whole movement called the Electric Universe. Thunderbolts.org has a lot of it, and they're very inspired. You know, they look to Velikovsky as their sort of the first guy who started this, in a sense.
Yes.
And when So finally, after reading some of their posts and finding it really interesting, I went back and read Worlds in Collision and was very impressed with it. And literally, as I finished it, I thought, I wonder what modern science says about this. And realized that's a daunting task to go through all that scientific effort to find out. But you did this. This is what your book is about, isn't it?
Well, that's right, because I realized for a long time I had wanted to write about Velikovsky, because it seemed to me that here we had been 50 and 60 years from the time Velikovsky wrote, and in that time there had been so much science. It seemed to me like there ought to be one fact you could point to that would be would turn the controversy, that nobody could argue, that would show that either Velikovsky had to be right or he had to be wrong, and that why hadn't anybody found that fact yet? And so I wanted to go through all of the recent good information we've been getting about Venus and Mars and Jupiter and comets and other scientific bodies, and try to sift through that and see if I could find that fact and turn the controversy one way or the other.
And in the end, which side do you think comes out stronger?
Well, in the end, I think the Velikovsky's comes out stronger, and the reason that I do is because there are several different stages to Velikovsky's scenario, and at each one of these stages, if Velikovsky can be shown to be wrong about even one of his points, major pieces of his theory fall apart. At each stage, there's always a set of maybe a half a dozen facts like that if they went the wrong way, Velikovsky's got to be wrong. But time and time and time again, when you look at those facts, what you find out is there's an inconclusive answer. I compare it to vetting a murder suspect. What the police do when they're trying to figure out who committed a crime. They'll bring the suspect in, and they'll say, now, where were you on the night of Saturday the 27th between the hours of 8 and 9 o'clock? Now, if you can demonstrate that you weren't at the murder scene then, they let you go and they don't have to worry about you. Well, so that's sort of what I was trying to do with this book with Velikovsky, was at each of these scenarios say, now, is there a fact anywhere that flatly says this has got to be false? And the problem is that there isn't, and that in every case what you end up with is a half a dozen considerations that the scientists have to come up with an explanation to explain away, but that would all disappear if Velikovsky were right. And to me, that's the hallmark of a theory that is right, not a hallmark of a theory that's wrong.
Okay, and did you go into this with any expectations of him being right or wrong?
No, I really was mostly concerned in trying to resolve it, and I couldn't understand why after 60 years it hadn't been resolved. And I would have been happy if it had resolved either way, but to be able to say definitively, look, here is the drop-dead reason why Velikovsky can't be right about this thing. But instead what you find is that at 750 BC, when Velikovsky says Mars made its close approach to Earth, you have very odd things happening. For one thing, just after that, cultures all over the world who had a 365-day or 360-day year for thousands of years suddenly all changed to a 365-day year. Cultures that weren't in contact with each other.
And that's really fascinating, because that's not something that's just going to happen at random. How does traditional science explain this?
They don't. I mean, they say they look at the 360-day year as if it were a ceremonial year. So I went to my friend John Anthony West and I said, I know you're in contact with Egyptian scholars who know every last fact about the Egyptian calendars. Could you please ask them to provide me with a one-sentence explanation for why the Egyptians had to have a 365-day year in ancient times? Turns out they can't. It turns out the actual evidence that their opinion's based on is contradictory.
Really?
That it can be looked at one of two different ways, and if you look at it one way, you conclude there was a 365-day year. You look at it the other way, and you conclude it was 360. And that's the way all of this evidence falls. Two different ways to look at it, might be right, might be wrong. But you have really odd things happening. Like, for instance, when they calculate eclipse dates that happened in the past, they have computer programs. It should be straight math because the planets should be moving like clockwork. And the star, the sun and the moon and everything should be moving like clockwork. So they should be able to take a formula and calculate backwards and pinpoint the date and location of every eclipse that happened back into time. Turns out the calculation doesn't work across the 750 BC boundary.
Huh.
That they have reliable observers before 750 BC saying, "Oh, by the way, I saw an eclipse in such and such a city on such and such a date," and their computer program can't prove it. Now, I ask, what could possibly cause that except a change in motion of something?
And what would change the number of days of the year? What effect would create?
Well, there's a couple of things that could make that happen. It could happen if the distance of the Earth from the sun changed. If we got a little bit farther away from the sun, that could cause the year to be longer. It could happen if the speed at which we move around the sun slowed down just a little bit. It could happen if the speed at which we rotate on our axis speeded up a little bit. We'd end up with more days in a year. There are a number of different things that could legitimately cause it. The most likely thing looks to me as if our distance from the sun was increased a little bit.
Really? And did that have any other effects that Velikovsky could pinpoint?
Oh, there are lots of very interesting things that happened. Okay, for instance, if you had another astronomical body come that close to the Earth, you would expect a major period of eruptions of volcanoes. And sure enough, at the two intervals that Velikovsky says the close approaches were made, suddenly you have this huge increase in the number of volcanoes that are erupting. You can see evidence of it in the Greenland. You can't see direct evidence of it in the ice cores that they make, but you can see indirect evidence because there are chemical values that change based on these eruptions.
Okay. And go on.
Got things like you've got a change at 750 BC in the absorption rate of carbon by plants. So carbon dating doesn't work across the 750 boundary.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, something really major happened. There was also a major fluctuation in the magnetic field at 750 BC that nobody can explain why it happened. And you also have major changes in climate all over the world at 750 BC, so much so that you have Germanic tribes suddenly moving south all at the same time. And you have, very odd things going on that imply that there was, you have crops that were traditionally grown in China that could no longer be grown there.
Oh, all right. And there's also Venus itself, which has a lot of telltales of being a comet, doesn't it?
Yes, again, that until some of the recent probes, the Venus Express probe discovered a lot of things about Venus that weren't known before that make it look as if Velikovsky could be right. For example, Velikovsky had said that some of this was known a while back. That he said, look, if Venus is young, then it should still be very hot. This was back in 1950 when science fiction writers were saying we ought to be able to colonize Venus.
And the predictions were it was going to be a very cold place.
Well, it was going to be a temperate place, is what they expected. But when we got there, we discovered the surface was hot enough to melt lead.
And if I remember right, the criticism was that he didn't specify a temperature, so he was wrong.
Yeah, that's right. That's in the end they said, well, it doesn't count as a prediction because he didn't specify what temperature they were going to find it at. But he's talking about a body that got ejected at, we're not sure what temperature from Jupiter, if he's right, that moved through all sorts of different neighborhoods of the solar system at various temperatures that we don't know what they were, that would have had interactions with other planets that would have likely increased the temperatures in a way that we don't understand, you can't quantify. And so really there's nothing more anybody could say about it except that we know that it should be hot.
And,
but you have other situations like you've got they've confirmed the existence of basalt on Venus, which is it's a volcanic rock that forms shortly after an eruption, like within the first few thousand years. But they haven't confirmed the existence of granite, which takes millions of years.
Okay. And it also has its magnetic field kind of points towards us, doesn't it?
It has a very weak magnetic field. Now, the magnetic field of the Earth is something that they feel had grew over time as heavy metals sank to the core. the more heavy metals you have at the core, the more the magnetic field grows. Well, Venus, if it's a young planet, shouldn't have a strong magnetic field, and it doesn't. But what it does have is it has an ion tail that acts very much like a comet's tail. It points away from the sun. It gets stronger as Venus gets closer to the sun. And every time Venus makes its closest approach to the Earth, a couple of things happen. First of all, it always points its same face to the Earth, which is could be an indicator of a close approach between the two planets. It's called resonance. But this tail extends out into space at that point as far as the Earth, and it points directly at the Earth.
Okay. And now the Thunderbolts people also have gone a good way toward proving that the destruction on Mars was caused by another body coming in and exchanging literal like lightning bolts between planets. And they go as far as to say the asteroid belt was once a part of Mars that was just literally thrown into space. And this seems like it would support the whole Venus idea colliding with Mars.
Yes, I mean, and Caltech did a study that showed that the damage they see on Mars could be the result of a single impact by a planet-sized body. And there are all of these different scientific studies that have been done. What I tried to do with my book is I tried to restrict myself to sources that had not been available to Velikovsky, and sources that had no reason to either support or be against him. They didn't have an axe to grind with Velikovsky. And so a lot of my sources were NASA websites and things like that. We've got astronomic records from ancient China that are synchronized with astronomic records from ancient Korea that on the same day are described by two different observers in terms that normally are reserved for comets.
Huh. And now,
we've got all sorts of different evidence like this that is very suggestive. Certainly, the least you can say about it is that it certainly allows for the possibility that Velikovsky could be right.
Okay. Now you mentioned references, and I know you've talked about how a lot of the stuff you cited in this book as for references online have disappeared.
Yes, I had to put a disclaimer in the front of the book because, back in the day when everything was published on printed paper, if you were an author who published a study, the moment it got published, it was fair game for another author to read and quote and cite. Well, these NASA websites in particular, articles that go up on the NASA websites pass through a very, very rigorous review process before they hit the website. So someone has done fact checking and someone has cross checked to other people's theories, and it's all reasonable stuff when it hits the website. The problem is that when my editor went through my manuscript and followed the links that I gave and went back to the websites that I was quoting, she discovered time and again that the passages that I quoted either had been changed or paragraphs removed or whole articles dropped, not only from the NASA website, but from half a dozen other websites that I knew they had been on originally.
Huh.
And so I had to put a disclaimer in the front of the book saying, look, folks, this should have been fair game for me to quote. All the best I can do is say to you that I affirm that each of these quotes looks the way that it looked at the time that I quoted it. The ones that I could download and have copies on my computer of, I did. And the other ones, I don't have control over what NASA puts up or takes down from their website. But the best I can say is it was there once. It was fair game to quote when it was there.
Right. Okay, we're almost out of time. I wanted to ask you a couple other quick things. First of all, a lot of people dismiss Velikovsky because of Carl Sagan. You want to talk quickly about that?
Yes. Again, Carl Sagan is the same person who is trundled out to put the kibosh on the Dogon information also. He was a popularizer of science that your average person would listen to. Carl Sagan made a number of comments about Velikovsky's work that have turned out to not be correct. One thing he said was that he characterized the kind of event that would have to have happened at Jupiter to produce Venus. He said it would have had to have vaporized large portions of Jupiter, and that those portions of Jupiter would remain intensely hot even today if Velikovsky were right. Well, as it turns out, there is a Chinese study that was done recently to try to explain why the core of Jupiter is half the size that it should be and twice as hot as it should be. And the computer study concludes that a body slammed into Jupiter at some point and vaporized the core. So in a lot of cases, the complaint that Carl Sagan makes against Velikovsky ends up turning into the evidence that supports him.
Okay, and didn't they have some kind of meeting or something that was supposed to have officially dismissed Velikovsky's theory?
Yes, the AAAS held a symposium in San Francisco in 1973 or 4, that was touted as a referendum on Velikovsky's theory. And they promised Velikovsky that he would have time to answer all of his critics. But the way they ended up setting up the conference, they had half a dozen people speak against Velikovsky and then gave Velikovsky equal time with one, every speaker had the same amount of time. So there really was six times as much time devoted against Velikovsky as for him. And most people in the public came away feeling that Velikovsky's theory had been refuted by that 1974 symposium. But the truth of the matter is that all it really did was put the scientists in a position to sweep the whole issue under the rug and not have to talk about it.
Yeah. I think the only thing with the book I had a problem with was his theory of the whole manna from heaven issue coming from Venus's tail.
Yes, and one of the approaches I took with the book was to say that a lot of the chemistry that Velikovsky includes in his Worlds in Collision book, there's not enough evidence to evaluate it.
Yeah.
In other words, it's a very generalized statement of here's the general chemical reaction that probably happened, not knowing what the composition of Jupiter was or what Venus might have been at the time any of these events happened. And so I took the approach that I wasn't going to try to evaluate that. I'm not trying to prove or disprove Velikovsky's chemistry. Let's look at the things that we can quantify a little bit and see how they stack up and leave the chemistry to speculation.
Okay. The Dogon actually had a list of like planetary bodies and stuff like that. Did they say anything in particular about Venus that's relevant?
No, the Dogon don't have any information about Venus that is pertinent to what Velikovsky has to say. Other ancient cultures do talk about Venus before 1500 BC, but the references they give and the drawings they make and the icons they use to represent Venus all have comet symbolism.
Huh.
And so, and then the deities that are associated with Venus with this comet symbolism eventually turn into deities that are associated with the planet Venus. But there's nothing definitive to say that Venus was a planet when it was first documented by these cultures.
And when supposedly would this have happened? Like when did something slam into Jupiter? Does he give an exact date?
No, he doesn't give an exact date. We know that the approach that Venus was supposed to have made to the Earth happened around the time of the eruption of Thera, which is about 1500 BC. What we don't know is for how many thousands of years Venus might have roamed as a comet prior to that.
I see. Okay. All right. Do you think if science actually worked the way it should, that Velikovsky would be held in high regard today?
It's very hard to say because it's not just the scientific world that works this way. Anytime there's an entrenched theory that a lot of effort has gone into, there's going to be major effort to try to not undermine that. And so it's hard to say that whether science could have an open enough mind to be able to embrace somebody like Velikovsky. It is true these days. The statistic I've heard is that most of the game-changing discoveries that are being made in science these days are being made by people who are outside the field. And that, I think, Velikovsky had a major influence on that being true.
All right. And there's a rumor, too, that Einstein died with Worlds in Collision open on his desk, isn't there?
Yeah, and I haven't been able to verify whether that's actually true or not. It's reasonable because they were friends and close friends, and just before Einstein died, there was a discovery made that supported Velikovsky that Einstein wanted to evaluate. So it makes sense to me that he probably would have, even if it wasn't there the night he died, he certainly had been looking into it.
All right. Well, we're pretty much out of time. Let's, one more time, people can get your books, obviously, in all the normal places, but also from innertraditions.com.
That's right.
And your new book will probably be out. You have an estimate?
I would guess it'll be a year or a little less.
Okay. All right. And when did the Velikovsky book come out?
The Velikovsky book has been out since October of last year.
Okay. That's the Velikovsky Heresies. And
That's right.
you have an unofficial website at lairdscranton.com.
That's right.
Okay. Well, I thank you so much for calling in. And,
Well, thank you. And I'll be sure to be in contact with you when the new book comes out.
Yes, I'm very curious to see what you've come up with. Your work is excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Last Exit for the Lost is up next, taking you out with some Psyche Corporation.
Come